to my poor ex.
The laughter came before he even reached his seat. Marcus stood near the back of the grand ballroom, one hand resting lightly on the top of an empty chair, his eyes moving slowly across a room that had not been decorated with him in mind. He was not on the guest list. He had not received an envelope with gold foil lettering and a formal request for his presence. He had come anyway, quietly, deliberately, without announcement, the way a man who has nothing left to prove tends to move through the world. His suit was a charcoal gray that had been pressed but not recently tailored, and it fit the way old clothes fit a man who had grown into something larger than the garment could contain. There were no cufflinks catching the chandelier light. There was no pocket square folded into a perfect triangle. He was simply a man in a room full of people who did not know what to make of him, and for the moment, he was content to let them wonder. The ceremony had already concluded by the time Marcus slipped through the side entrance of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, and the cocktail hour was giving way to the seated dinner, with the kind of effortless excess that spoke of budgets that had never once been questioned. Tall floral arrangements rose from the center of every table, all white roses and eucalyptus, and something imported that nobody could name but everyone admired. The room smelled of expensive perfume and fresh-cut flowers, and the particular brand of self-congratulation that tends to fill a space when the people inside it believe they have arrived. And then she saw him. Vanessa Thompson, now Vanessa Hargrove, as of approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes ago, was standing near the head table when her gaze swept to the back of the room and landed on a face she had not expected to see. The expression that crossed her face was not surprise exactly, or not only surprise, there was something else layered beneath it, something older. Something that flickered for just a moment before her social training took over and pressed it back down. She leaned toward the woman beside her, a bridesmaid in a dusty rose gown who had been laughing at something someone else had said, and she said it quietly enough that it might have been a private remark. But in a room where the ambient noise had briefly dipped between a song change and a waiter's announcement, it carried. It carried to the table nearest the back. It carried to the man standing alone near the empty chair. It carried, perhaps, further than she intended. "Look at that," Vanessa said, her voice carrying a particular lightness that women sometimes use when they want to seem unbothered by something that bothers them quite a lot. "That's my poor ex." The bridesmaid turned. A nearby guest turned, and then another. And Marcus, who had spent the better part of a decade learning exactly how to absorb the weight of a room turning against him without letting that weight show anywhere on his face, simply stood where he was. The Whitmore Grand was the kind of hotel that charged $400 a night for a standard room and made you feel as though you were getting a discount. Its lobby featured Italian marble and a chandelier that had once been featured in an architectural magazine, and its event spaces were the preferred venue of every significant wedding, corporate gala, and charity auction that Westfield County had hosted in the last 15 years. It was not a place where people arrived in modest sedans and sat quietly at the back. Or rather, such people existed in this space only in certain capacities, as servers, as staff, as the men who appeared with fresh napkins before the old ones had quite hit the floor. The guests who filled the ballroom that evening were, by and large, people who had spent their lives in rooms like this one, and they carried themselves accordingly. They were people for whom the name of a restaurant or the label inside a jacket, or the neighborhood where a man lived, served as a reliable index of his worth. And Marcus, in his unadorned charcoal suit, with no entourage and no table assignment, and no one to introduce him, registered in their collective awareness as something incongruous, something slightly off, an instrument playing in the wrong key. Several guests at nearby tables recognized him, or thought they did. Someone whispered that he used to date the bride, years ago. Someone else added that it had ended badly, or that she had ended it, or that he had never quite recovered. The details were imprecise, but the shape of the story was familiar enough, and people filled in the gaps with the information they had available, which was mostly the information in front of their eyes. A man standing alone, wearing a suit that had seen better seasons, at the wedding of a woman who had clearly moved on to better things. A few people smiled, not cruelly, or not entirely cruelly, the way people sometimes smile when they see something that confirms a story they already believed. And then, from across the room, Vanessa began to walk toward him. She moved through the crowd the way beautiful women at their own weddings tend to move, as though the space itself were making way for her, as though gravity operated slightly differently in her vicinity. Her dress was a confection of ivory silk and hand-sewn beading that had taken 3 fittings and 6 weeks to finish, and it caught the candlelight in a way that made several people reach for their phones. She was striking, and she knew it, and she wore that knowledge the way she wore the dress, with complete ease, with the casual authority of a woman who had never seriously doubted her own position in any room she entered. Marcus watched her come. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He waited, with the particular stillness of a man who has long since stopped using other people's reactions as a measure of where he stands. When she reached him, she stopped just far enough away to be speaking to him rather than at him, close enough that the people nearest to them could hear if they chose to lean in, which several of them did. "Marcus," she said. Her voice had the particular precision of someone constructing a sentence in real time and monitoring its impact as it landed. "Why are you here?" It was not the warmest greeting a woman had ever offered a man at her wedding, but it was also not technically unkind. It was the kind of question that carries its real meaning in the pause before it, in the slight emphasis on the word you, in the faint uplift at the end, that transforms what might be genuine curiosity into something closer to a challenge. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not grief, not the wounded pride that she might have expected to find there. Something quieter than all of those things. Something that, if she had been paying a different kind of attention, might have unsettled her. "I was in the area," he said. And then he smiled. There had been a time, not so long ago, measured in years, though it felt like a different century, when Vanessa let herself think about it, when that smile had been the thing she looked for first thing in the morning. Marcus Johnson, at 28, had been, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable man. Not remarkable in the ways the world most readily recognizes, not remarkable in the way that announces itself in designer clothes or imported cars, or the particular bored confidence of men who have always had enough, but remarkable in the quieter, more durable ways that tend to go unnoticed until they are gone. He had grown up in a small house in a neighborhood that did not produce many men who went on to do significant things, and he had left that house at 18 with 2 suitcases, a partial scholarship to a mid-tier university, and an idea. The idea was incomplete at the time, more of an instinct than a plan, a conviction that there was a particular gap in the way mid-sized businesses managed their capital, and that if someone built the right structure around that gap, the results could be significant. He did not have the vocabulary yet to describe what he meant. He worked in a copy shop on weekday evenings and a restaurant kitchen on weekends, and he read everything he could find about private equity and asset management and the mechanics of how money moved between institutions, and slowly, painfully, the vocabulary came. He met Vanessa in the spring of his second year in a library study room where she had been working on a business communications assignment, and he had been surrounded by prospectuses and yellow legal pads covered in his own handwriting. She had asked what he was working on. He had told her, and she had looked at him, really looked at him, with the particular focused attention of a person encountering something genuinely new, and said, "That's either very smart or completely insane." He had said, "I'm working on finding out which." She had laughed. He had fallen, in that moment, completely, and without reservation. They were together for 4 years. In many of the ways that mattered, they were good years, years of shared meals in small apartments, and long conversations about the future, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who have decided to bet on each other. Marcus worked. He always worked. He was not the kind of man who confused motion with progress, but neither was he the kind who confused waiting with patience. He moved consistently, methodically, with the focused attention of someone who understood that the gap between where he was and where he intended to be was real and measurable and closable if he did not stop. Vanessa worked too in those years, and she was talented, and she was ambitious in her own ways. But somewhere in the 3rd year, something shifted. It was not a single moment, but a series of them, small accumulations that gathered weight gradually, the way sediment builds on a riverbed. She began attending more events with colleagues from the firm where she'd taken a junior position, events where the men wore the right watches and the women wore the right shoes, and everyone had already achieved the kind of visible success that Marcus was still some years away from. She began asking different questions. Not accusatory questions, not cruel ones, just different. How long until the business starts generating real revenue? When do you think you'll be able to afford a place of your own? Have you thought about taking a position somewhere more established while you build this on the side? The questions were not unreasonable. In fact, taken individually, each one was perfectly sensible. It was only in their accumulation, in the texture of what they added up to over the months, that they began to feel like something else, like a slow revision of her assessment of him, like the cautious hedging of someone who is beginning to suspect she has placed her bet on the wrong number. He never blamed her for it. That was the thing that surprised him most about himself in those years, that he never quite arrived at blame. He understood the logic of what she was doing, even as it moved him from the center of her vision toward the periphery. She was a practical woman, and practicality has its own form of courage, even when it calculates in ways that cost something. The last year was difficult. They had a conversation in November that lasted 4 hours and ended with more clarity than either of them had been prepared for. She was not in love with the struggle anymore. She had been, once she was honest enough to say so, but the struggle had gone on longer than she'd expected, and she was not sure she was built for indefinite waiting. And she had met someone, and the someone was solid, in ways that Marcus was still in the process of becoming. He did not argue. He sat with what she said for a long time, and then he told her that he understood and that he hoped she found what she was looking for, and that he did not regret the years, not one of them. On her way out the door, she turned back once, and her voice had a roughness to it that she could not quite smooth out. "I'm sorry," she said. "Love doesn't pay the bills, Marcus." He had stood in the doorway of his apartment, the small one, the one with the water stain on the ceiling and the view of a parking structure, and watched her go. Then he went back to his desk and worked until 3 in the morning, and then again the next day, and every day after that for the next 9 years. Daniel Hargrove had built his fortune in commercial real estate, which was to say he had arrived at the right time in the right markets and had possessed the particular combination of nerve and access that allows a certain kind of man to convert proximity to money into money itself. He was 43, tall, with the easy physicality of someone who had access to good trainers and the discipline to use them, and he had the polished assurance of a man who had spent so many years being told he was successful that the belief had become architectural. Something built into the foundation of how he held his shoulders, how he crossed a room, how he looked at other men, and measured them against himself before they had finished shaking his hand. He was not, by the standards of his world, a bad man. He was generous with charitable donations in the ways that provide tax advantages and social capital simultaneously. He was faithful, as far as anyone knew, or at least careful. He loved Vanessa with the particular possessive tenderness of a man who had selected something beautiful and considered its acquisition a testament to his own discernment. He knew about Marcus. Vanessa had told him the broad strokes of it, the years together, the difficult ending, the ex who had never quite made it. Daniel had filed this information in the category he maintained, for things that had preceded him and therefore didn't merit extended analysis. He was the current chapter. Whatever Marcus represented was old text, footnote material. When he spotted the man standing alone near the back of the ballroom, he had the same instinctive, almost involuntary response that men of his particular formation tend to have when they encounter someone they have already categorized as lesser, a small, internal satisfaction, the quiet pleasure of comparison that resolved cleanly in his own favor. He made his way over eventually, drawn partly by Vanessa's attention and partly by his own curiosity, and he looked at Marcus the way a man looks at something that does not threaten him, and therefore does not require him to be anything other than magnanimous about it. "You know," Daniel said, his hand resting on Vanessa's back, with the easy proprietary weight of ownership freshly formalized, "I think you probably would have been happier at home tonight." He smiled as he said it. To make it a joke, To make it the kind of thing a generous man says when he is being sporting about a situation that requires no sportsmanship at all, because the outcome is not in question. The dinner progressed, the way expensive dinners at beautiful venues tend to progress when the people eating them are performing their own happiness for an audience. The first course arrived and was praised. The wine was poured and discussed. The speeches were delivered, and the speeches were good, and the room responded to them with laughter and applause, and the particular emotional warmth that gathers when a crowd has given itself permission to feel something. Marcus sat at a table near the back, placed there by a seating chart that had allocated him no position at all, and therefore left him to find his own. The people at his table were cousins of someone and friends of someone else, mid-tier guests who occupied the social periphery of the event and were therefore free to observe its center without the obligation of performance. They were curious about Marcus in the way that guests at the edges of weddings tend to be curious about anything unusual, eager for a story, willing to be entertained. Someone asked what he did. He said he worked in finance, which was true in the way that calling the Pacific a body of water is true. Someone else said they'd heard he used to date the bride. He said that was a long time ago, which was also true. The conversation moved on, but it moved on in a specific direction, guided by whispers that had been moving through the room since his arrival, gathering detail and speculation as they traveled. By the time the main course arrived, at least 3 tables had the broad outline of a story: the ex-boyfriend who had never succeeded, who had shown up uninvited to the wedding of the woman who had left him for better things, and who was now sitting alone in his modest suit with nowhere particular to go. The story had the comfortable shape of a cautionary tale, the kind that makes the people telling it feel reassured about the choices they have made. Vanessa, who had spent the last hour and a half being a flawless bride and receiving the collective admiration of a room that wanted to give it to her, had relaxed into the role completely. She was radiant in the way that people who have prepared for a very long time to be radiant tend to be radiant on the day itself. And then, somewhere between the main course and the dessert, in the loosened atmosphere of wine and warmth, and the general agreement that the evening was going well, she stood up. It began as a toast. Or it began in the form of a toast, with Vanessa lifting her glass and the room settling into the expectant quiet that forms around a raised champagne flute. She spoke first about Daniel, about the life they were beginning together, about the particular richness of choosing correctly and knowing it. And then, with the confidence of a woman standing in the center of the most significant evening of her life, surrounded by everyone who loved her, and an open bar, and the specific invulnerability that comes from believing the room is entirely yours, she let her gaze travel to the back of the hall. She did not mean it to be cruel, or she meant it in the way that cruelty sometimes disguises itself as humor, as lightness, as the kind of thing you can walk back with a laugh if you need to. But the wine had loosened the calculation, and the audience had loosened it further, and she said it clearly enough that the room heard it as she intended it to be heard. "I want everyone to raise a glass," she said, "to good choices." She paused. "I once loved a man who had dreams bigger than his bank account. Sweet man, sincere man." Another pause, and her gaze still resting on the back of the room. But sincerity doesn't build a future. She tilted her glass in Marcus's direction, with the gentle finality of someone closing a door on a room they had long since outgrown. "To my poor ex," she said, "wherever life takes you." The room laughed. Not everyone. A few guests near the back exchanged glances that suggested discomfort, but enough. Daniel laughed. The bridesmaids laughed. The laughter moved through the tables the way laughter does when a room has already agreed on a shared understanding of what is funny and what is not. Marcus did not move. He did not change his expression. He held his glass water, as it happened. He had not touched the wine all evening, and he looked at Vanessa with those quiet eyes, and he waited. He was good at waiting. The sound came from outside. It was low at first, the kind of deep mechanical purr that a single high-displacement engine produces when it is idling somewhere close, and it would not have been remarkable, except that it was followed almost immediately by a second sound, and then a third, and something about the layering of those sounds, the deliberate spacing, the identical registers, caused a change in the room. Not a dramatic change, not a gasp or a commotion, more like a subtle recalibration, the way a conversation pauses when something new enters the peripheral awareness of everyone in it simultaneously. A server near the main entrance moved toward the window. A few guests turned in their chairs. The hotel's front drive, which was visible through the tall windows along the east wall of the ballroom, was ordinarily occupied by the catering vans and the idling town cars that served the venue's clientele. What was now visible through those windows was something else. 3 SUVs, each one black, each one identical in the way that vehicles belonging to a coordinated security detail are identical, bearing no identifying markings, but radiating the kind of intentionality that comes from vehicles that have been chosen for a purpose, were pulling slowly up the long, curved driveway of the Whitmore Grand. They moved in sequence, with the particular measured spacing of a convoy that has practiced being a convoy. They stopped at the main entrance with a precision that suggested the driver of each vehicle knew exactly where the others would be before they arrived there. The doors of the hotel opened. A pair of men in dark suits, who were clearly not wedding guests, came through first, their eyes moving across the lobby with the particular efficiency of people trained to assess a room for variables. The hotel manager, who had been directing the flow of the evening with the practiced calm of someone who had managed 400 weddings and knew how to absorb surprises, appeared from somewhere near the kitchen corridor and moved toward the new arrivals with an expression that was, for the first time all evening, not entirely composed. And then a third man came through the entrance, taller than the others, in a suit that was not the kind that gets pressed and then forgotten. He looked at the manager and said something quiet, and the manager nodded, and then the manager turned and walked into the ballroom. The room was still processing the interruption. The conversations had not fully resumed after the convoy's arrival, leaving a strange, suspended quiet over the tables nearest the windows when the hotel manager appeared in the doorway of the ballroom. He was a man named Richard, who had managed this property for 11 years and had navigated every manner of complication that a high-end event venue attracts, and he was not, as a rule, a man who was visibly affected by arrivals, no matter how prominent. But there was something in his bearing tonight, something in the careful precision of how he moved across the ballroom floor toward the back of the room that made the people he passed feel that whatever was happening was not routine. He stopped at the table near the back corner where Marcus was sitting. He leaned down slightly and spoke in a low voice, though several people in the immediate vicinity were close enough to hear. "Mr. Johnson," Richard said, "your team is here." It was a small sentence, 4 words, but the word team landed in the room with a particular weight that 4-word sentences do not usually carry, and the people nearest to the exchange registered it with the slight widening of the eyes that indicates a recalibration in progress. Marcus looked up at the manager with an expression of mild acknowledgement, the expression of a man receiving information he had already expected. He nodded once. And then one of the men who had come in from outside the tall one in the well-cut suit appeared at the edge of the ballroom and saw Marcus and moved toward him. And as he walked, the quality of his deference was visible from across the room. He stopped in front of Marcus's table, and he stood in the way that people stand before someone they consider to be of significant authority, and the room watched. "Chairman," he said. "Not Mr. Not sir. Chairman." The word fell into the quiet of the room and did not come back. The stillness that followed had a different texture than ordinary social silence. It was the stillness of a room recalculating. Several conversations had not simply paused, but had stopped entirely, and the people who had been having them were now fully turned toward the back corner, where Marcus Johnson was rising slowly from his chair with the unhurried ease of a man who has never needed a room's attention, and therefore is not affected by the fact that he currently has it. Across the ballroom, Vanessa had gone very still. The champagne glass was still in her hand. Daniel, beside her, had lost some of the ease that had characterized him all evening. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the small, specific ways that confidence retreats when it encounters something it had not accounted for. The men who had come in from outside formed a loose arrangement around Marcus, not surrounding him in any conspicuous way, but orienting themselves in his direction with the quiet consistency of people whose professional purpose is defined by his location. The hotel manager was speaking quietly into a radio. 3 members of the waitstaff had stopped moving. Someone at a table near the center of the room said something to the person beside them in a voice too low to hear, and the person beside them shook their head slowly. Someone else was typing rapidly on a phone. What they were finding, What the phones in that room were collectively discovering in real time, as the names were searched and the results came back, was this: Marcus Antoine Johnson, age 38, founder and chairman of Meridian Capital Group, a private investment firm managing approximately $4.2 billion in assets across 7 sectors, with portfolio holdings in commercial real estate, technology infrastructure, logistics, and emerging market bonds, established 9 years ago from a single converted office space in a building that no longer exists. Ranked among the 40 most significant private investors in the country by 2 separate financial publications in the last 3 years. Known in the circles where such knowledge is current for 2 things: an extraordinary capacity for patient, long-horizon investment, and a nearly absolute commitment to operating outside the public eye. No social media presence, no celebrity endorsements, no speaking engagements, unless he chose them. Just work and results, and the kind of accumulated weight that only becomes visible when someone finally turns a light on it. Daniel Hargrove understood money. He had spent his adult life in proximity to significant sums of it, had structured deals that moved 8 figures across tables, had sat in rooms where the numbers under discussion would have been abstract to most people. He was not naive. He understood. When the name Meridian Capital Group surfaced on the phones around him, and the number attached to it resolved into something specific, that the man he had told to stay home was operating in a category he had not previously assigned him to. He understood it the way that a person understands something they were not supposed to need to understand suddenly, and with the particular discomfort of a reclassification that cannot be undone. He said nothing immediately. He set down his own glass with a carefulness that was itself a kind of response, and he looked at Vanessa, and Vanessa was not looking at him. She was looking at Marcus, who was now standing, who was now exchanging a few words with the tall man who had called him chairman, who was now adjusting the cuff of his modest suit with the complete unhurried ease of a man who has somewhere better to be and is deciding exactly when to go there. A woman at the table nearest to where Marcus stood said something to her husband in a lowered voice. A group of Daniel's business associates near the front had gone very quiet, in a way that was not the quiet of people who had lost interest. An older gentleman at a corner table, a man who had been in the industry long enough to recognize a name without a phone, had set down his fork and was looking at the back of the room with an expression that said he understood, something the rest of the room was still catching up to. And through all of it, Marcus stood with his hands in his pockets, completely still, waiting for the moment that had belonged to him since before any of these people had arrived in this room. He did not make a speech. That was the first thing, the most important thing the room would remember afterward. He did not raise his voice. He did not command the space, or demand attention, or do any of the things that men who have been publicly diminished and then publicly vindicated tend to do, which is to make sure that the vindication lands as loudly as possible in the faces of the people who did the diminishing. He simply stood for a moment, and he let the room be what it was, and then he spoke in a tone of voice that was conversational, pitched for the people immediately around him, and only incidentally audible to those beyond, which somehow made everyone within range lean in. He looked at Vanessa. He had known her when her hair was shorter and her laugh came easier, and her ambitions had not yet hardened into the shape they now held. He looked at her the way you look, at someone who is both very familiar and very far away. "I heard what you said earlier," he told her. "Not unkindly. I don't hold it against you." She opened her mouth and closed it again. He continued, still quiet. "When you left, I had nothing that looked like success yet. You were right about that part. I was asking you to see something that didn't exist anywhere except in here." He touched his chest briefly, without drama, and then dropped his hand. "That's a hard thing to ask someone to do. I understood it then. I still understand it now." The people nearby were absolutely silent. Not the performed silence of an audience, the involuntary silence of people who have stopped thinking about themselves entirely and are just listening. "What I built," Marcus said, "I built because I had no choice but to build it. Not to prove a point, not to show anyone anything. I built it because it was what I was supposed to do, and because when you removed yourself from the equation, the only variable left was work." He paused. Something passed through the room, not a sound, but something like the temperature dropping by a single degree. "I don't wish you anything bad, Vanessa. I'm not here because of resentment. I came today because a mutual friend asked me to stop by." He looked at her steadily. "I think I've stayed long enough." For a moment after Marcus finished speaking, nobody moved. The room had the quality of a breath being held, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the way that a room holds itself when something real has just happened in it, and the people inside are not yet sure what they are allowed to feel. Vanessa stood at the head table with the champagne glass still in her hand, and her face, which had been so carefully composed all evening, had arrived at an expression that she had not planned. It was not guilt, precisely, though guilt was somewhere in it. It was not regret, though that was in it too. It was something more specific and more difficult, the particular expression of a person who has just understood that they have been wrong, not about a small thing, not about a matter of preference or opinion, but about something foundational, something that had been organizing their understanding of a whole chapter of their life. She had told herself a version of Marcus, a version in which he was the man she had left behind, because he was going nowhere, the man whose refusal to compromise his vision for the sake of her timeline had been a kind of flaw rather than a kind of virtue. She had needed that version, had carried it with her into the years that followed, had offered it to herself occasionally as evidence that the leaving had been correct. And now the version was revising itself in real time, without her permission, in front of 200 people who had just been given the information to do the revision alongside her. Across the room, Daniel Hargrove was receiving a quiet briefing from one of his associates, the older gentleman who had recognized the name, and the briefing was having visible effects. He was the kind of man who recovered quickly from recalibration, who had the social elasticity to absorb a shock and present a functioning face in short order, but the shock was evident in the way that shocks are always evident to the people looking for them. In the slight stillness at the jaw, in the fractional narrowing around the eyes, in the way he did not look at Marcus directly, but did not quite manage not to look either. Several of the guests who had laughed at Vanessa's toast were now not laughing. One man, who had been particularly vocal in his mockery of Marcus's suit and bearing, had become very interested in the centerpiece arrangement. A woman who had followed Vanessa's pointed gesture with her own smirk had found something urgent to discuss with her husband in a low and private voice. The room's emotional weather had shifted, and it had shifted completely, and everyone in it felt the shift whether they acknowledged it or not. The people who moved toward Marcus in the minutes that followed the ones who approached with sudden warmth, with business cards, with the slightly too eager friendliness of people who have recognized an opportunity and are hoping the window is still open. Marcus received them with a courtesy that was genuine and a brevity that was also genuine. He shook hands. He answered a few questions with the economy of a man who does not overfill the spaces that are offered him. He was not cold. He was not dismissive. But neither was he drawn in by the sudden heat of attention from people who had found him unremarkable 12 minutes earlier. He had too long a memory for that, and too clear an understanding of what attention built on recalibration is actually about, which is to say that it is almost never about the person receiving it. One of Daniel's associates, a man in his mid-50s, who had apparently been doing business in overlapping sectors with Meridian Capital for the better part of 3 years, and who was now experiencing the particular vertigo of realizing he had been sharing a ballroom with his indirect counterpart without knowing it, introduced himself formally, and suggested they arrange a meeting. Marcus said he would have his office reach out, which was the kind of response that is perfectly pleasant and commits to nothing, and which the man received with a gratitude that was somewhat disproportionate to the information it contained. Someone else asked about Meridian's position in a particular asset class, and Marcus said that was a conversation better suited to a different setting, which was entirely correct, and was received with the nodding of someone who had been gently and accurately redirected. Through it all, he was composed in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He was not performing composure. He simply had it, apparently, since before any of the people in this room had formed their first opinion of him, and would presumably have it long after they had gone back to their conversations, and their champagne and their revised and still incomplete understanding of who he was. Vanessa found her way to him eventually. It was not the most graceful thing she had ever done, moving through her own wedding reception toward the man she had toasted as her poor ex, with the full awareness of the room's attention following her as she went. But she did it, because she was, underneath all the choices she had made that brought her to this night, not a coward. She stopped a few feet away from him, and looked at him for a moment before she spoke, and in the looking, There was something that might have been the closest she could get, in this setting, in this dress, to honesty. "I don't know what to say," she said, which was, under the circumstances, probably the truest sentence she had produced all evening. Marcus looked at her with those same steady eyes that had not changed much from the man she had known at 25. "You don't have to say anything," he told her. "The night is still yours. Enjoy it." It was a kindness, and she felt it as a kindness, and she also felt the other thing underneath it, the gentle, permanent finality of a door being closed with complete care and complete quiet, not slammed, not left ajar, just closed. The way things close when the person closing them has made their peace with what is on the other side. She nodded. She could not quite trust her voice. He nodded back. And then he turned and said something to the tall man who had arrived with the convoy, something quiet and brief, and the arrangements that had already been in motion began to complete themselves. His jacket was straightened. A phone was passed to him, and then returned. The two men near the entrance adjusted their positions in the way that people adjust when a moment of waiting is transitioning into a moment of movement. He walked through the ballroom, the way he had arrived in it, without announcement, without performance, with the measured ease of a man who takes up exactly as much space as he requires, and no more. People watched him go. Some of them watched with the slightly dazed expression of people who have just witnessed something they will be describing for years. Others watched with a more private attention, the attention of people processing their own responses privately, running through what they had said or not said, or laughed at, when the laughter had been directed at this man, who was now walking past them with his hands in his pockets, and no visible awareness of any of them. He passed the table where he had been sitting, and he did not look at it. He passed the head table where Daniel stood, and he did not look at that either, or not quite. There was perhaps a fractional pause, a fraction of a second, in which the two men occupied each other's peripheral vision with the awareness of men who have existed, this evening, at the poles of a comparison neither of them sought, and then he was past it, and walking toward the doors. The tall man walked a half step behind him, and the two near the entrance moved to bracket the exit with the smooth efficiency of a choreography that had been practiced many times. The doors of the Whitmore Grand opened. The night air came in, carrying the scent of the gardens and the distant sound of traffic, and Marcus Johnson walked through. The three black SUVs were waiting exactly where they had been. The nearest driver had the door open before Marcus reached it. He paused before getting in one moment, a single deliberate beat, and looked back at the lit windows of the hotel, through which the shapes of the wedding guests were visible, still watching, still adjusting, still rearranging themselves around the new information the evening had given them. He did not smile at this. He did not feel the satisfaction of a man who has bested someone. He felt something quieter and more difficult to name, something that existed in the space between grief and gratitude, in the particular ache that comes from standing at the end of a long road and recognizing, clearly and without sentimentality, exactly how much it cost to walk it. The convoy pulled out of the Whitmore Grand's curved driveway in sequence 1, 2, 3, their taillights moving through the dark, with the quiet authority of things that know exactly where they are going. Inside the hotel, the wedding reception continued. The music was still playing, the champagne was still being poured, the flowers were still tall and white, and impeccably arranged on every table. The evening had not stopped being beautiful, but something had changed in the texture of it, something that would persist long after the last guest went home, and the last glass was cleared, and the photographs were organized into an album that would tell a slightly different story than the one that had actually happened here. Tonight, in the weeks that followed, Vanessa would think about Marcus in the mornings, in the particular unguarded space between sleeping and fully waking, when the defenses are not yet in place. She would think about the man she had been so certain she understood, the man she had categorized and dismissed, and then offered, cheerfully, as a cautionary tale at her own wedding. She would think about the years she had spent with him, the small apartment, the legal pads covered in his handwriting, the way he had looked at the future with an absolute and undefended certainty that she had once found attractive and later found insufficient, and now, from the distance of everything that had happened, found to be the most extraordinary thing about him. She did not regret Daniel, exactly. She was fond of him, in the complex way that people are fond of choices that are correct by the criteria they were using when they made them. But she understood, in the mornings, that she had spent years measuring Marcus against the wrong standard. She had wanted someone who already looked like success, someone whose arrival in rooms was already confirmed, already announced. She had not understood or had not wanted to understand that the most significant arrivals are often quiet, that the things built from nothing and built slowly and built with complete commitment tend, in the end, to exceed anything that was handed over cleanly, that the men who do not need a room's approval are usually the ones who have earned the most right to it. She had stood at the altar of a beautiful hotel and lifted a glass and pointed at a man she thought the world had passed by. But the world had not passed Marcus by. It had been waiting for him. And on the night he walked into her wedding in a modest suit with no announcement and no apparent purpose, it turned out that the world had already arranged itself around him, in ways that the room full of people with their expensive clothes and their casual certainties had never bothered to notice. Many people spend their lives believing that success is a declaration, something you make in front of an audience, something that requires witnesses, something that only fully exists when other people can see it and confirm its existence. They measure themselves in visible units: the address on the envelope, the label on the jacket, the name of the car and the driveway. They believe that worth is established outward, toward the world, that the point of building something is to stand beside it and say, loudly and clearly, "Look at what I have done." And sometimes this belief is harmless, and sometimes it is the source of a particular sadness, the sadness of people who have spent their whole lives performing for an audience whose approval they needed and who arrive, eventually, at the suspicion that the performance and the life have crowded each other out, that in the effort to be seen, something essential about the act of being has gone unattended. Marcus Johnson had not built what he built in order to be seen. He had built it because it was the work he was supposed to do, because the idea that had been forming in him since his early 20s demanded the form of it, because every morning, for 9 years, the only honest answer to the question of what he should be doing had been the same answer it had always been. And because of this, because the work had been its own reason, rather than a means to someone else's confirmation, he had arrived at a place where a room full of people thinking small things about him was simply a fact, without consequence, a weather system he had dressed appropriately for and passed through. He did not need Vanessa's revised opinion of him. He did not need Daniel's discomfort. He did not need the business cards and the sudden warmth of men who had spent an hour finding him unremarkable. He had walked into that ballroom, and he had walked out of it, and the distance between those two moments had cost him nothing he wasn't willing to pay, and given back nothing he hadn't already given up on needing. Back inside the Whitmore Grand, Vanessa sat down at the head table after Marcus left, and the evening went on around her. Daniel put his hand on hers, and she let him. The music continued. A cousin made a late toast that got a good laugh. The cake was cut, and it was beautiful, and they fed each other the first piece with the practiced intimacy of people who have choreographed this particular gesture. Photographs were taken, more wine was poured, and Vanessa smiled through all of it. She was good at that, had always been good at that, the maintenance of a surface that did not transmit what was happening beneath it. But in the middle of the dancing, when the lights were low, and the music was soft, and the room had settled into the comfortable warmth of late evenings that are going well, she found herself looking at the back corner, where Marcus had been sitting. The chair was empty now, pushed slightly in from where he had risen, the water glass still on the table next to it. She looked at that chair for a long time, not with drama, not with the visible suffering of a woman reconsidering her choices at her own wedding reception. Just quietly, the way you look at something that holds an important amount of truth. She thought about what she had said at the toast. She thought about the word poor, the particular, pointed weight she had given it, the way she had aimed it across the room at a man sitting alone, the absolute confidence she had felt in that moment that she was right, that the word fit, that the room agreed with her. She thought about the fact that the room had agreed with her, and she thought about the way the room had stopped agreeing, how quickly that certainty had dissolved, how completely the evening had turned on a single word that a man in a dark suit had spoken without raising his voice. Chairman. And she understood not comfortably, not without the particular grief that true understanding sometimes requires, that she had been standing in this beautiful hotel for the last several hours, feeling like the richest person in the room, and that Marcus Johnson had sat quietly in the back corner feeling like himself, which turned out to be the same as something immeasurably larger, and that the distance between those two things was not a distance she had put between herself and him. It was a distance she had put between herself and her own better judgment 9 years ago, on a November evening, walking out a door. She was surrounded by flowers and music, and the particular radiance of a life that had been assembled with great care to look exactly the way she had wanted it to look. And she was, by every visible measure, the most fortunate woman in the room. But in the quiet that lived beneath the music, in the small, undefended space that exists between one breath and the next, Vanessa Hargrove felt, for reasons she would spend a long time learning to explain, like the poorest person there.